Hi, everybody, and welcome. It is noon Mountain Time here in Rapid City, and you are joining us again for another installment of the Forest Health Workshop series. This week, we are talking about our 2023 review and our 2024 forecast, what we can expect possibly down next spring and this winter. So Dr. Ball will be discussing those topics today. Also, any questions, please add them in the chat box. We should have some time towards the end to address any of those. Any Society of American Foresters Certified Foresters credentials can be added in the chat box for collection to be given that certification unit, and we should have a code for ISA arborists at the end of the webinar for self-reporting. So thanks again for joining us. Our workshop being recorded. That recording going to be put on our YouTube page for later viewing. That website, the YouTube link will be posted in the chat box for any past workshops as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony. We'll see about getting it shared here, and I think we're in business. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating today in our workshop here. We do them monthly, and I like to look at it more as a workshop because I'm hoping you can ask some questions and put them in the chat box. Tony's really good at the end of to kind of put the questions together on topic, and if it's something that needs immediate clarification before we can go any further, he'll alert me to that and we'll cover it at that time. But we'll try to do a lot of the questions at the end. So the real critical thing here is this kind of a review of what happened in 23, and then a few little predictions or what I might expect to see in 24. So, why are my trees dying? That's a question a lot of us got as I look through who's involved here today. As people call us up, we go out there, look at their trees and try to figure out what the problems were. So we're going to take a look at the whole year. But I want to start out with a couple reminders. Always appreciate the samples that are sent to me here at South Dakota State University, and I get a kick out of some of the boxes. This was a box that had a lot of samples in it, and I love it. Warning, contents may cause happiness. There's no happiness in that box. I'm looking at a lot of different plant materials. So just a couple reminders when you're going to send in samples. First of all, mail them on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. The reason for that is they got a pretty high likelihood of arriving at my office by Friday. What we don't want to see, or we want to try to avoid, are samples that actually spend some time, by that the weekend, in a post office somewhere. Seal them in a plastic bag, add a dry sheet of paper towel into the bag. Don't add moisture. You're sending plant material, and that plant material is still going to give off the moisture that it has. If you add a damp paper towel in there, and if it sits somewhere over the weekend, when it arrives at our office on Monday or Tuesday, what I'm looking at is mold. And it's really hard to find what the problem is because it's buried underneath a lot of other mold that is going to really mask what the real problems are. So send them dry. This was a shout out to Fall River Conservation District. This was a great sample. Everything perfect. They put it in a plastic bag, put a dry paper towel in there, and you'll probably still notice that there's a little bit of moisture in there. Again, any live plant material is going to be transpiring, giving off moisture. The dry paper towel in there kept that to a minimum. So when it arrived, there was no mold. But what I loved about the sample is not only was it a perfect sample with great information as to where it came from and what the person thought it might be, is it was in such good shape. I was even able to find the honey locust pod midges in the sample, and they were still alive. So it was just the perfect sample. Plastic bag, mail on a Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, put a dry paper towel in there, and that's great. Do not mail us dead samples. By that, I mean just a twig, nothing alive to it anymore. At that point, all we can tell you is it's dead. What you want to know is why it died. And for that, we need a sample that contains some living, or preferably all living material. The only thing that shipping us dead helps is dead insects. Do ship us dead ones, not live ones. They get really annoyed when they come out of the bag or whatever little pill bottle you sent them in. But everything else, we need live rather than dead. And watch the size. I get a number of these body bags, as I call them. Just you send almost the entire spruce, or at least a large branch or two. Now, be a little more selective. Send us a couple of tips that may have some dying needles to them, or maybe part of the shoot has died back, and you're looking for us to kind of figure out what the problem might be. All right, well, let's go through the year. We'll start out last March, and last March, of course, we had the confirmation of emerald ash borer up in the Moorhead area. So now it's kind of bordering North Dakota, and of course, as you'll find out a little bit later, it's kind of running throughout the eastern side, or not in our state yet, but on the eastern side of our state in the adjacent state, and that being Minnesota. Angie from the Minnesota Department of Ag sent me these pictures, because I said, hey, can you send me a couple of pictures of what you found up in Moorhead? And there is one of the insects that they pulled out. That is certainly an emerald ash borer. What you can see is it has those bell-shaped segments. It also has, if you look on the left side of the picture, it has those two little pinchers that occur on the butt, and they use those to pack all their frass. That's the poop, if you will, that they pack behind them. So you always have these sawdust-filled tunnels to it. She also sent me a picture of this, and you can see the galleries that were created by one of the emerald ash borer larvae they found in the Moorhead area. And if you look almost at the top, you see the large part of the tunnel there just disappears. Notice that it gets wider and wider as you're going to the right-hand side of your screen there, and it stops. And what it's showing you there is that was the overwintering chamber. Emerald ash borer overwinters in the sapwood. So eventually, as you follow the tunnel, and if you really notice, the tunnel started on the right-hand side, and you'll notice with that winding, as you're going to the left, it got larger and larger and larger, and then wound back to the right-hand side, and then burrowed into the wood to spend the winter. And that's where they found them. Well, what else went on? We had a lot of snow this winter. And so we ended up with a lot of branch breakage. This was up in Corson County, but I looked at a lot of areas in the northern hills, the northern half of our state, where we had a lot of branch damage and windbreaks. And a lot of this was not related to Zimmerman pine moth, which weakens branches. It was just snow loading. There were cedars that were buried, and we ended up with a lot of branch breakage there too. So the heavy snowfall that we saw in the northern part of our region, I'll call it, since I know we have North Dakota listeners as well and viewers, that we saw a lot of that this year. And everybody saw this. The critter damage was incredible this year. Deer were browsing spruce. Spruce are starvation food for deer, but they were yarded up in small areas, and they ended up going through and just browsing them, and pines. Now, you'll notice on the pines here, it looks like it's torn at the top, and that's what deer will do. They're more of a tear the needles, tear the shoots as they're feeding because of their incisor pattern. And this was a picture that I took back in March where the deer had gone through on these pines and just shredded a lot of the needles. They were bad this year, but worse were bunnies everywhere in the region. Bunny damage, the calls kept coming in and coming in and coming in. And what you'd find here is the feeding along the lower shoots or stems, and of course the Cocoa Puffs, the poop surrounding it. This was a burning bush, Euonymus alata. It's one of their favorite foods. We often refer to it as rabbit candy. They like it so much. And if you look closely, notice you can see the two chew marks going through this, and they were cutting all through the inner bark, what we call the phloem tissue. That's where the sugars are, and even cutting a little bit in the sapwood. Now, some people noticed that they didn't see this heavy of rabbit browsing until about March, and that's fairly normal because in the spring, the inner bark turns a lot sweeter just before bud break, and the rabbits really go for it. Now, I did see some damage even earlier, January, a little bit in the February, but it was really March that the calls and the pictures started coming in. Now, this picture didn't come in March. This is a picture that came in a few weeks ago, and it was because of the damage in the spring. What happened is at the base of these fruit trees, these were apple trees, the rabbits had girdled them. They'd browsed all the way around it, cut through all the phloem tissue, and a little bit of the sapwood too. So what happened is everything above the damage was killed, but the tree resprouted from the root system. So the question on this one was, can I cut away the dead top and keep one of these sprouts coming at the base? Well, you certainly can, but you don't want to. And the reason for that is all your apple trees are grafted, as well as your pear and your other fruit trees. And if the rabbits browsed all around the base, so it's suckering up from the roots essentially, what you're getting is the root stock, not the cultivar you bought. And I get this all the time. Someone says, well, you know, the rabbits have girdled my apple tree, or your crab apple even. And I cut away the top and it sprouted from the base, but now the flowers are different and I'm not getting the same fruit. That's absolutely correct. Because what happened is the cultivar you bought, it could be anything from a sweet 16 apple to a jewel crab apple, it's coming from a rootstock and it's not the same plant. So unfortunately, anything the rabbits girdled that's sprouting back, you're better off just ripping it out of the ground and replanting the original one you wanted next spring. Well, not only did we see a lot of rabbit damage this year, and I mean, the calls came in from everywhere, but the squirrels were equally active. This was a buckeye that the squirrels had browsed. Notice they went all around the branches. They did that on sugar maples and on homestead buckeyes. Not every buckeye, just some of the cultivars. But they went through and browsed the entire branches. They also did it on one of their favorite foods, which is hackberry. And this last spring on the hackberries, they not only girdled a lot of branches, but they also nipped a lot. And I get calls from people saying, I notice on the ground around my hackberries or my elms, all these little shoots. That's squirrels. All right, well, what happened in the insect world? Every spring, I get calls from people or pictures of this insect. This is the banded ash borer. It's one of the first adults to emerge in the spring, and if you get a warm spring day, they will literally be swarming around dying ash trees. So I see this more as a shelter belt issue. And when people say, what do I spray? You don't. This insect is out there finishing off the dying. So it's telling you the tree's already dying. It's not the reason the tree's dying. And if you cut a dying ash tree out of your shelter belt, split it into firewood in the fall, and then stored that wood in your house during the winter, These will start emerging in your house as well. I'll get calls from people saying, I'm getting these insects bouncing off the windows and that. It's just this, the banded ash borer. It's got those two little circles that you'll notice on the base of the wing covers. And they're not going to hurt anything in your house, just something for the cats to play with and to bounce off your windows for a couple of days. You can open up the window, let them out if you want. But they're not going to harm any of your furniture or anything else in your house. What about emerald ash borer? In April of this year, they started forming what we call the prepupal stage, where they're kind of curled up in that sapwood, and they're becoming pupae. And that usually occurs by about May. In May, they shrink. They're still in that overwintering chamber, but they're no longer curled. They shrink into this form. And now we know they've probably got about 3 weeks before they become adults and begin emerging. And this year, they emerged right on schedule, which is about Memorial Day, about the time black locust is in bloom. When we see black locust blooming, we can expect emerald ash borers to be emerging as adults. Well, what else did we see in May? A huge seed crop. The elms just were covered with seeds this year, as well as the silver maples. So I got call after call after call, these little helicopters coming down off my maple tree. It just was a big seed crop this year. And a lot of it we tribute to the drought. During droughts, a lot of trees will produce an abundance of seed. Why? Because they're stressed. They may not live. Now's the time to produce young. So we saw elms and silver maples, trees that typically seed in the spring. Those are often floodplain trees. And just the crop was incredible. But this was the biggest thing, particularly on the eastern side of the state. Was not a real issue on the western side of the state. And the farther south you went, the more you saw this. I would say most of this problem occurred from about Highway 212 in South Dakota south, because of the drought that they were in last year. And then this year, what happened was winter desiccation injuries. Call after call of maple trees that the top half was dead. Generally young maples, sometimes even saplings, or small ornamentals like this. What happened is the trees went into last winter dry. And then we had a bad combination, a dry fall and a long winter. And trees can give up moisture through their shoots and their buds. Maples, birch are probably the two worst. These do not like to store in coolers over winter. I remember this when I was working in nurseries back in the 70s. These would end up getting a freezer burn, if you will, if we stored them too long. They desiccate very easily. And dry trees out in the landscape with those winter winds, and those winter winds kept coming for a long time period, they just dried out. We saw this before in 2012. I even have maples on my campus that survived that. You had to cut out the dead top and let them resprout. But I was getting people call me about maples all summer, and birch, that the common one was, well, the top half is dead. There's another good example. Norway maple here. Look at that. You could almost draw a line across it. It was so apparent. And I was still getting calls in August. So this is a picture that I took in late August. Producer had me come out and take a look at his maple trees, and the top halves were just dead. And I said that was from last winter. Well, that's why I was reminding everybody, particularly East River, that had been under drought conditions all summer, that you should have been watering. All right, you should be watering. Now, it's a little late for everybody now, though it's still warm enough that a little water would not hurt. But hopefully you've been watering back in August and September to prepare the trees for winter. And when I typically looked at something like this and I said, well, did you water them last fall, meaning the fall of 2022? Nope, didn't. Well, this is what happens. We saw some unusual problems too in May. All the apple trees were in blossom, including the crab apples, but those flowers were collapsing. Western flower thrips. We do not see this every year. We did not see this coming. But just the calls were coming in from left and right that, oh my gosh, my apple blossoms are fading away. And I went out and collected some samples, and there's the Western flower thrip. Now, normally this doesn't do a lot of damage, but it seemed to damage the flowers this year as well as the frost that we had. And because of that, lots and lots of small orchards were finding that they had a very poor apple crop this year. And that was coming all the way up the eastern side of their state that, you know what, a lot, not all, some had a lot of fruit this year, but a lot of them that normally have a good harvest had a very poor harvest. And those were the orchards where I was finding the Western flower thrift in it. Again, do I expect to see that next year? No. That just periodically occurs, one every 10 years, perhaps. What else did we notice? Well, remember back in April, and this is from Sioux Falls, but it's a good description of what happened to a lot of communities. We ran into some hot days in early April. I mean, 90 degrees in April 13th, and then it dropped. It dropped below freezing. It got very cold. And what was interesting about that cold is it really just stopped development. I was getting lots of calls about maple trees with the leaves coming out kind of a greenish red. That's normal when we have cool conditions. So what happened is the trees had a lot of these anthocyanins in them, not a lot of chlorophyll. So the leaves were coming out a little red and people were panicking. Well, what do? Nothing. As the temperature warmed, the leaves did turn to green. But if we get a cold spring, you'll find a lot of trees that normally have a red fall color have a red spring color just because of the coolness. Not a real problem. Well, in May, what else did I see? Let's start out with shoulder belts. And what I was going out and looking at is shoulder belts that had been planted the previous year. In other words, the spring of 2022. And by the spring of 2023, all the plants were dead in some of these belts, or all the cedars were dead in some of these belts. And on this particular belt, which was planted in the spring of 2022, I said, what was in this ground the year before? And you could kind of get an idea. Well, yeah, it was corn. Did you use atrazine? Yes. Atrazine has at least a 2-year carryover. And I know the conservation districts are getting very good at asking producers this question. And the reason why is there's lots of plants that if you put them in the ground the next year, they're not going to make it. The worst I saw was a belt that had been in corn the year before it was planted. The producer had used atrazine in the summer, which is perfectly normal. But the next spring it was planted, and cedars were one of the plants, and they're very sensitive to it. Well, they all died. So they replanted the cedars the following year, and I was still able to pick up very high levels of atrazine in the plants. Now, some plants, interesting enough, some of the cherries, they don't even bat an eye at it. But districts are getting very good at asking producers what was in the ground the year before, or for this year, they're already asking, okay, you want to plant next year, 2024, what was in the ground for 2023? What herbicides did you use? Because there's a number of herbicides that have a very long carryover, and you may not be able to plant that following spring or the spring following that even. It may need 2 years. But it's also time to inject for emerald ash borer in May. We want to have the leaves coming out. The ideal is the leaves are coming out so that you're going to have the chemical pulled up. But the other thing is ash are a ring porous tree. They have to produce their new growth ring, which is going to be where the chemical's pulled up before they put leaves on. So if the leaves are coming out, you know that growth ring that's pulling all the water up has already formed. And that's important for ring porous trees, such as oaks and ash. On maples, which are diffuse porous, no, it's not as critical. But I don't want to see people injecting their ash trees, and only inject in areas to which we have a infestation. So West River people, nope, it's too premature to be injecting. But in areas where we know that there's a high probability that it's there or it's already confirmed, then yes, inject the trees in May when the leaves are starting to come out. And if you do that, you'll have the chemical there active throughout the tree by the time the adults are laying eggs. In May, the pupae were forming. Notice that you can see the eye spots for the emerald ash borer. As I pointed out earlier, that in May they're starting to go through their pupal stage, so they can emerge at the end of May for Sioux Falls, South Dakota. A little earlier down in the Dakota Dunes area, and I expect up in the Moorhead area it was a little bit later because, again, growing degree days do not accumulate as quickly the farther north you go. But for us, at about 550 growing degree days is when adults emerge. And by the way, 550 growing degree days works almost anywhere. So for those folks up in the Moorhead area, at about 550 growing degree days, that's when you can expect the adults to begin emerging. And about a week or two after they emerge is when they're going to start laying eggs. In that time period between emergence and laying eggs, they're feeding on ash leaves. And one reason we want to get the chemical in there early is if you've treated your tree and mom comes along and chews on leaves, she's going to die before she even lays eggs. And that's really our best strategy. Kill mom. And that's what the adult looks like. They're about 3/8 to a 1/2 inch long, very narrow, torpedo shape. The insect that we get it most often confused with is this, the yellow spotted jewel beetle. And notice it's a little bit fatter. Now it is a buprestid, so it's close related, but it's not the same insect. It's just one of those brightly colored jewel beetles. But these come out a little bit later than the emerald ash borer. But nevertheless, it's about the same time period, sometime in June. And so people say, well, I found emerald ash borer and they're out in Lyman County, West River for South Dakota. And I'll say, send me a picture. And it's always this insect until we get out to the Black Hills. And then there's the golden buprestid, which is just a bright bronze throughout. But for most of West River, East River, into Minnesota, and into North Dakota, this jewel beetle is very common, and it's the one most frequently confused for emerald ash borer. Well, what about the weather? For everybody that drives to Wall Drug, this is a sign at about exit 132 on I-90. This is my rain gauge for West River. And what I look at is, has it been a good year? It depends on if the water's up to the sign or even covering part of the sign. It was a little low going into spring this year, but we had a lot of rain, West River. Look at this. Faith, South Dakota, so far has accumulated 21.4 inches of precipitation this year. Sioux Falls, South Dakota, only 16.9. And if we look at South Dakota, and I apologize for the North Dakotans watching, I did not include the drought in your state. But if you notice, we've got severe drought in that Minnehaha area, Lincoln County, Moody County area, even up to Brookings, and then up in the Northeast. Those areas is where I expect to see more desiccation injury on maples, birch, and if they have some young seedlings that were planted this year in a belt, this is where I expect to see significant mortality if the producer did not water. And by the way, this goes all the way down to Charles Mix. Charles Mix, Brule County, Rohr County, that whole area was under drought for most of the summer. And for some areas, it was a third year of drought. So I do expect to see some damage. But West River this year, everything was turned around. West River was wet. East River was dry. Here I am looking at a shelter belt out near Faith of Rocky Mountain juniper back at the end of June. What was unusual, the first thing I noticed is normally I can wear shorts when I'm out looking at shelter belts West River. This year I was eaten alive by mosquitoes, but I could come home and sit in Brookings in my backyard on the summer, not swat a single one. It was so dry. But for West River, what did we see because of the moisture this year? We saw aphids. I was just amazed at the crop of aphids in a lot of our shelter belts, West River. And on this one, these cedars, the Rocky Mountain junipers, were covered with the giant conifer aphids and all the ants that were protecting them. And they were removing a significant amount of sap from these plants, which was resulting in some yellowing of the foliage, some significant damage. I mean, look at all the aphids on this stem. What else did we see in June? We saw the emergence of the pine looper, and most of you are going, what's the pine looper? It was kind of an interesting insect for 2022 and 2023. This is the adult moth. This is the damage that it did in 2022. It defoliated a long area of trees, but only near Pringle, South Dakota, in the southern Black Hills, south of Custer and north of Hot Springs, for those that aren't quite sure where Pringle is. And it was a long ridge where we saw almost 100% defoliation by this insect. And the last time we had an outbreak of it was 1972. How's that? You have to go back 50 years to find where it popped up. Now, it's always in the Black Hills, but very low populations. But this was very widespread defoliation along that entire ridge, one ridge in the Black Hills. But in that one ridge, it almost completely defoliated the trees in 2022. And then the overwintering stage are these pupae. And guess what? You could go out and pick out buckets of them from the litter layer in the soil. You might have to dig a little bit in it, go down maybe 3 or 4 inches, but it wasn't hard to fill a whole container like this. So we knew in 2023, we were probably going to see it come back, and it did. So defoliation started in 22 and continued through 23. So think of it. We had pine trees that were defoliated very heavily in 22. Then in 23, they start coming back. And since it was wet, they did. But unfortunately, they were defoliated again in 2023. And I'll be chatting about that as the season progresses. What else did we see? We saw a lot of sawfly problems this year. East River, I think mostly because of the drought. But if you take a look at those kind of fingers you see in that circle, those were ash sawflies. I rarely see them. But this year, under the dry conditions, we had homeowners and also belts with ash in them, noticing that they were being defoliated by midsummer by these insects. And these are sawflies, not caterpillars, but sawflies that were just in a group chowing down the leaves. And if you went up and disturbed them, they would all rear their head at once to try to alarm you, thinking you're perhaps a bird that might want to feed on them. We also saw elm sawflies, which feed on willows and elms. They're not very good at ID, apparently. But we had a lot of defoliated elms, and again, most commonly were the willow trees. And I saw some willows that were completely defoliated by this insect up near the Clark Webster area in South Dakota, northeastern South Dakota. And then West River, down in the southern hills, pine sawfly. And they were out there feeding it. In fact, we found them in the same area, Pringle. So we had some pines in the Pringle area that were defoliated by the pine looper and the pine sawfly. Now let's go back to the pine looper. We did find the adults flying. And by the way, there's not a lot of information on this insect. There were 2 publications, and they weren't even sure if they were day flyers or night flyers. Well, guess what? We found they fly during the day and at night. We had light traps out, and we'd catch them at night, and then during the day you could catch them in a sweep net. There's the eggs they lay. Now, they lay the eggs in cluster, but each of the larvae feeds singly, in other words, by itself, whereas sawflies tend to feed in groups. So it's pretty easy to separate them. And you can see why they're called a looper. They're geometric, and they move by moving the thoracic legs, the legs near the head, rearing up the back, and then their pro legs at the rear grab onto the needle, and they move up the thoracic legs, and it's almost like a slinky as they move along, but they feed singly along the needle. And notice that this insect kind of looks like a twig, and the bigger they get, the more twig-like they look. Well, in July, emerald ash borer was feeding away. The larvae were in their second instar. At this point, they're getting big enough that they're actually causing a little bit of damage to their host. If the trees had been injected back in May, you would not see this, because the chemical very easily kills any larvae that hatch. Now, again, in most cases, we're killing mom before she even lays eggs on that tree. But if a mom happened to lay eggs without feeding on the foliage for the injected tree, once those eggs hatch, the young larvae are very quickly killed by the chemical insecticide. And so the tree goes without any damage at all. But for untreated trees, again, within the counties to which we know we have infestations in South Dakota, which would be Minnehaha, Lincoln, and Union counties, that you were able to find about the second instar in July. Well, start of August, what was I looking at again? This year, I hate to say it, but it was mostly atrazine. It was not only atrazine. We were finding a number of other chemicals with carryover injury, dicamba, for example, and a number of some others. But this was another windbreak, where you're noticing here it wasn't the cedars, it was the silver maples, and they all died, or most of them died because of this. Now, with herbicide carryover, there is a difference in tolerance. So when you walk through the belt, it's not necessarily that every tree is going to die from carryover, or every species. Some rows will look perfect because that species was more tolerant. Cherries, for example. But others, the cedars, the maples, no, they're killed. Now, by the way, we also saw a tordon injury in belts that had been pastured the year before, and they'd used tordon. That can carry over for 2 years as well. Any of the picloram, the tordons, the grazons. So once again, it's important to know what was applied the year before planting of any windbreaks. Well, by August, this is what the trees along that ridge in Pringle looked like that had been defoliated by the pine looper in 22, and then were defoliated again in 23. Now, the literature did point out that they tend to go back and feed the same place they did the year before. In other words, 2 years of defoliation in the few reports we have is fairly normal. And with some insects, sawflies, where they have studied them a bit more, is they found that they like to go back to the same trees the second year. The needles are a little bit more nutritious for them the second year. And look at this. There's barely a needle left on these trees. And look how large the larvae were. What you looking at within that circle might look like a twig. It was not. It's actually the larvae, the caterpillar stage, the looper. Well, what we found in 23 was they did defoliate the same area. I'm highlighting that in yellow along that ridge. But then we found some satellite infestations a little bit more along 285 north of Pringle, and then going over in the Wind Cave area. We also were able to survey and find some defoliation there, which was the first year. So along that ridge, there was 2 years defoliation. The other is there was a single year defoliation. But you know what? No matter where the defoliation occurred, the larvae died. By late August, the larvae were not dropping down to the ground and going into the pupal stage or continuing to feeding. They were all shriveled up. There's a fungal disease and a bacterial disease and a number of parasitoids that do feed on this insect. And the second year, apparently their populations build up. Now, which one that killed these, we don't know. It may be a combination of them. We certainly found some with the fungus on them, so we know that was a factor. And there were some parasitoids coming out of them, so we know those were a factor. But anyway, the population regulating factors worked. And we found very few live larvae. Unfortunately, they lived long enough to defoliate the trees, but they died before they pupated. Well, by August, we were finding fairly large emerald ash borers. And the importance of there is now they're big enough that they're actually really damaging the trees. So the trees that were infested by emerald ash borer that had not been treated, by August, you were starting to get some telltale signs up in the canopy that those trees were infested, because not only are they cutting off the tubes that carry the food through the tree, but they're also big enough that they're actually cutting into the sapwood, which means they're disrupting the movement of water as well. And August brought another confirmation in the Marshall area, in fact, in the town of Marshall. And as always, when they find it, it's been there for several years. So as I mentioned earlier, if you take a look at North Dakota and South Dakota, it's kind of lining up near our border. And I expect to see more emerald ash borer showing up in the counties. And it doesn't necessarily mean the next county we're going to find in is Moody. It could be Roberts County. It could be Dual County. It could actually even be Cottington County. But I think we need to be a little bit more on high alert for the eastern end of our state, since the adjacent state, Minnesota, is having it pop up along their western borders, both for South Dakota and North Dakota. With August, we actually started getting some rains, thank goodness. And because of that, we started seeing aphid problems popping up in the eastern part of our state. But I will say that we also had a number of their natural enemies feeding, so I wasn't quite as concerned. There was no need to spray for this. And we also saw some fairly common problems. The island chlorosis on hackberry, it makes these really bright blotches. As far as we know, it really doesn't harm the tree. Since it's a virus, it has not been studied. So that's why I say, as far as we know, it's not a serious harm to the tree, but it's one of those things that makes hackberry look kind of ugly by late summer. But we also saw a lot of chlorosis appearing in the eastern part of our state. This is a red maple, and you'll notice that iron and manganese deficiencies occur in maples. And we saw this East River. Why? Well, first of all, alkaline soils means that it limits the uptake of iron and manganese. But the other thing, combine that with a drought, and the trees are taking up fewer elements. So that was really a 1-2 punch. In East River, we found a lot more chlorotic maples than we typically see. And we saw premature fall color. The calls I was getting from trees turning red early August, and I was getting those in the Yankton area, is really pretty much due to drought. And it's telling, those trees are telling you they're stressed. They've gone through 2 years of drought. If they were not watered this year, I expect to see more mortality next year. And just some fun things we always get. In September, I get the calls. How do I roast the chestnuts I'm finding? They're not chestnuts. These are buckeyes. And buckeyes have a few little prickles on the fruit. And inside there, you will find the nut. The nut can be processed for eating. but it has to be heat treated to break down the toxins. You're probably not going to do that. So don't eat these nuts. They're so hard you'd break a molar anyway. By the way, they are poisonous to horses and cattle. Not only the nut, but the wilted leaves. So buckeyes are on my do not plant next to pastures or feedlots. But if you were in Minnesota, and by that, St. James area, Minnesota, they do have some really nice true chestnuts. That's what the true chestnut looks like. And those are great nuts. On the true horse nut, the entire fruit, if you will, is covered by these spines. Good way to keep squirrels from getting it until the fruit, the nut completely develops. But that's what the true chestnut looks like. September, what do we also see? Sawflies again. It was the year for sawflies. Mostly East River, but we saw them West River as well. And this is the dogwood sawfly that occurs, and it defoliates a tree, the shrub, excuse me. Quite often you don't notice it until it's completely defoliated, and by September, the leaves aren't going to be hanging on that much longer anyway, so it's not really critical. September 2, what did we notice? Well, in the communities to which emerald ash borer is established, the untreated trees are dying at a very high rate. Usually after we find it in a community, we know it's been there for a few years. And if the trees are not being treated within another year or two, you start noticing trees dying. This community here, we found the emerald ash borer in 2020 during the pandemic. Now here we are 3 years later, and just street after street of standing dead trees. If they're not being treated, or if infested trees are not being cut and destroyed readily. So what happens is we get this population building up very, very quickly. And these are very quickly also becoming a hazard, because standing dead infested trees, the wood is very brittle, and also the root system has been pretty much destroyed. So they tend to fall over. What else do we get every September? We get horntails. The horntails do have that stinger, but that stinger's an ovipositor, so it's not going to sting you. But we'll find these around big old silver maples. The silver maple tree is dying. What the horntail attacks it. Why? Because it's a good food source for them, but they're not really the reason that the silver maple's dying. And what a year for mushrooms. This was down in Yankton. These are oyster mushrooms that were occurring on a big hackberry. What does that say? That says that hackberry is pretty well rotted out and needs to be removed. We also had chicken of the woods appearing. Some of you know these are delicious. My caution to all our listeners and viewers is do not determine whether a fungus is edible from a mere screenshot in a presentation like this. I always remind people, if you want to go out and collect wild mushrooms, and there's a lot of great ones in South Dakota that are edible, I imagine North Dakota as well, go out with someone who has harvested them before, and they can show you. The internet and a PowerPoint are not great ways to learn how to identify mushrooms if you're looking to collect them for food. Puffballs were out too. And yes, puffballs harvested at the right time can also be edible in that. But once again, even something like this, make sure you've gone out with a experienced forager first. But what a year for these. And shaggy mane were coming up everywhere as well. And by the way, the stinkhorns. And they're called stinkhorns because they smell really bad. You have to put your nose up to them to notice it, but they come out in the fall. I've got a picture of a fly on it too. Why? Flies are attracted to them, just like they're attracted to anything that smells really bad. And they're the ones that actually collect the spores and spread it. But the interesting thing is, the last couple of weeks, been getting calls from people who've been digging in their gardens, and they're finding these. These are stinkhorn eggs. We call them eggs. It's the underground portion of the stinkhorn. It does look like a gelatin thing. Think of it as a Halloween candy. But this is what the above ground portion comes from. And these are about the size of maybe a silver dollar, if you want to know kind of a size. And if you rip them open, it is kind of a gelatin inside. Also, because it's been dry, particularly East River, and it's been sunny and warm. Wow. When the annual needle drop occurred on pines, they lose their third and fourth year needles. Is it noticeable? Look at these eastern white pines. So I was getting calls, my tree's dying. No, it's not dying. That's normal needle drop, but because it was a dry, sunny fall, it's very noticeable. Pine looper. Well, now we've got the winners and losers. Trees that were completely defoliated for 2 years, they're pretty much gone. Trees that were partially defoliated, they're surviving. But the ones that were completely defoliated 2 years in a row are already being attacked by Sawyer beetles. And so these are zombie trees, trees that are dying, and everything that attacks dying trees is finishing them off. And the good thing is we will not see a third year. We found very, very few pupae. Why? Because most of the larvae died, regardless of whether it was an area that was only defoliated for 1 year or for 2 years. And so it's doing like it did in 70 and 72. Showed up for 2 years, faded right away. They're still out there, but under very low populations. Well, for those West River folks that are watching, by that Black Hills area, yes, we are seeing mountain pine beetle populations popping up as well. Myself and then Tony has also been out looking at some areas that have been hit. And right now you're seeing small pockets of straw covered trees that were attacked last year, not this year. But we're seeing mostly strip attacks where one side of the tree, you'll see these pitch tubes where the trees were attacked. And you'll see these large, very bright pitch tubes. Quite often, these are pitch outs. In other words, the insect was not successful at attacking the tree. And if you pull the very light colored globs away, you can often find the insect that didn't get all the way into the tree. So this is not a time to panic for all the folks that remember the epidemic that killed 20 million trees. Mountain pine beetle is doing what it typically does during periods between epidemics. It is popping up, killing small pockets of trees, particularly stress trees, but we don't anticipate it becoming a landscape-wide epidemic as we saw from about 97 to 2016. Emerald ash borer is now moving into the sapwood of the tree where it's going to spend its winter. We're already seeing those in November. And then just a couple little oddities as we're finishing up. In South Dakota, eastern South Dakota, we had that May 12th derecho. And boy, did that cause a lot of trees to flip over. That one, and it was repeated in May. I spent a month just cutting up spruce trees. But we had an awful lot of trees that were left leaning. Look at this hackberry. Notice it's got a lean to it now. What happened is the root plate was damaged. The tree lost roots. And you know what we're seeing this year is a lot of inky caps. Inky cappers feeding on those dead or dying roots that increase in organic matter. So I'm reminding people that if you're in the derecho, you might want to go out and start looking around the base of the trees, because right now you may be seeing this. And that's a pretty good indication, particularly if the tree has been developing a lean, that guess what? It's still declining from the derecho from May of 2022 and probably should be evaluated by an arborist to determine whether or not that tree should be retained or should it still be removed. Finally, a couple of things. I got this. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with my spruce tree? Nothing. That patchy, flaky bark is pretty much normal on white spruce. And then I get this one. You get these seams on the autumn blaze maples. It's almost like it was a hot wax and someone stuck their finger and just ran it down, that's normal. These bark seams are perfectly normal on autumn blaze maples. They occur anywhere on the trunk. If we're getting cracks on the southwest side of the tree, that's an issue, but these seams are not, perfectly normal and highly noticeable on the otherwise smooth grayish bark. And then finally this, look at that. Looks like the tree swallowed a snake. Nope. Somebody left the white wrap that you can put around the trunk on too long. And I really don't think this tree is going to make it, but time will tell. So finally, what do I expect to see in 2024? This is like predicting who's going to win the elections. We're going to stay away from that question. But forecasters are saying we're going to see warmer weather, both winter and summer, and average precip. We're probably going to see a little bit more damage. And what? I expect to see more tree mortality in the southeastern part of South Dakota due to the 2023 drought. I know I'm going to get calls on declining maples, some belts, and it's all due to not something that needs to be sprayed, but the lack of water the last several years. Because of that, I do expect to see more borers. By that, two-line chestnut borer that attacks oaks. I also expect to see bronze birch borer that attacks birch, cottonwood borer, poplar borer, emerald ash borer will take advantage of it as well. So I do expect to see more borer problems in the southeastern quarter of South Dakota, and a little bit up into Roberts County too, and Marshall County, because they've been dry as well. Emerald ash borer, I expect to find it. My prediction is we're going to see it in 1 or 2 more counties. Again, to me, there's no reason it couldn't be Roberts County, for example, or Moody County, or Dual County in South Dakota, and probably in North Dakota as well. Again, it's a prediction. We have not confirmed it in those areas, but I'll bet we get a call from some county, one of the counties, about a declining ash in March, April, or May. That seems to be when we find the new infestations. Marshall County Marshall, Minnesota was kind of an oddity that it wasn't found until fall. Mountain pine beetle mortality, it's probably going to expand. We're going to see more pockets in the northern hills. But again, I do not expect to see a large-scale epidemic. And the pine looper, I predict, will disappear. So with that, I'm going to finish up the formal part of it. Everyone enjoy this warm fall weather. It's good for you, not so much for your trees. If you're an ISA certified arborist, the CEU code, and by the way, some of you have contacted me, ISA wants the exact title. So when you're submitting your CEU credits, it's 2023 Forest Health Review and 2024 Forecast, DS-23-025. But you need to have the title correct as well as having the code. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Tony, and I'll leave the screen up, but I imagine we have a few questions.
Got a couple here. First one is in response to some brown needles. I guess here in West River, I'll just read it verbatim. Here in West River, some pines had a lot of dead needles. Brown, mostly ponderosa pines. Could this have been from hail damage, and will the trees survive?
Good question. And really what you need to look at is where those needles occur, because West River has been wet. The interior needles, which is the normal needle drop, a lot of those, the needles are dropping brown, not as brightly colored as the east. So if you look and you say, oh yeah, the needles are occurring in the interior, perfectly normal, occurs every year, it's brown and maybe a little bit heavier this year because of the moisture. If the tips are turning brown, then that's probably Diplodia. And yes, we have seen an increase in Diplodia tip blight because of the hail. Now, the hail didn't cause it. The tree was already infested with it, but the stress of the mechanical injury from the hail cause the symptoms to present. And those trees should probably be treated next spring so they don't become reinfected.
I know there's a couple comments underneath that question. One suggesting that it might be pine wilt disease, but we know that pine wilt disease doesn't affect the ponderosa pine like it does our non-native pines. And I can just say anecdotally, anyways, did see a tremendous amount of the seasonal needle drop in the hills as I'm driving to meet landowners and throughout my projects. A big year for that, where it was very noticeable, and I even got some calls saying what's happening to my trees, and
And
a lot of it is that seasonal drop.
You're right, Tony. I mean, statewide, a little brighter on the East River than West River. And yes, for all of the viewers here, pine wilt disease does not affect ponderosa pine. It affects Scots pines and Austrian pines. And yes, we did see that, not higher than normal, but it is statewide. So anywhere in the state, a Scots pine or Austrian pine that all the needles just turned kind of a tan and wilted in the fall, that's pine wilt disease, a nematode. That tree should be destroyed by next April 1st so that the Sawyer beetles do not carry the nematodes to nearby healthy trees. Okay, any other questions, Tony?
That is all I have right now in the chat, Dr. Ball.
Perfect. We're right at 2, or for
Awesome.
2 o'clock East River, 1 for yours.
I'll just send one more reminder. If you have any Society of American Forester credentials or your SAF credential number, please add that in the chat. I do have one more question that popped up. Is it important to search out and cut down any pine beetle damaged trees in the Black Hills?
Yes. If we're talking about mountain pine beetle larvae are in the trees during the winter. They will emerge as adults next July, end of July, a little before rally. And for those, yes, removing those trees that are infested, not just a strip attack, but the infestation, you find the pitch tubes all around the tree, and they were successful. They're smaller, redder. Those trees should be cut down sometime this winter. If it's only one on a forest, don't worry about it, even 2. But if it's a small pocket, it would be good to do that for. If it was pine engraver beetle, and we did not see a lot of that this year because it's wet, no, those trees are dead, and most of the pine engraver beetle adults, they pass the winter as adults, are actually in the duff layer, so it's not critical to remove that tree. So identification is important. Contact myself or Tony so that we can go out there, we can get a forester out there to look at it for you in the hills to determine what you have. If you're East River or outside the hills, it's not mountain pine beetle, okay, because mountain pine beetle for us is pretty much in the Black Hills.
And I guess I have one other question that popped up here. This will be the last one for today. Can you please just talk about cottonwoods aging out at Lewis and Clark, and are you seeing that anywhere else?
Yes. First of all, we are seeing that in the Lewis and Clark area. The Dale down there has been very good sending us pictures. We're even finding the hermit flower borer. And what it does is it lives in dying trees. And so what we're seeing is overmature cottonwoods that are dying as part of their normal life, maybe accelerated a little bit because of the drought conditions for the last couple of years. But yes, those trees are just need to be removed. They're not going to survive. I find those all the way from Dakota Dunes, all the way up Charles Mix County along the river, but very old, already declining cottonwoods that borers are attacking them because they're stressed and dying. So treatments are really not going to be effective. A chainsaw is going to be effective.
Well, then that should do it, Dr. Ball. Anything else from you?
Nope. That's it for me. We'll be doing one more of these in a year. The next one will be how to select and care for your Christmas tree. So Tony will have that up here. We'll probably do it in early December. just to make sure you have time to utilize that information. But we always like to finish the year in kind of a holiday spirit. So the next one won't be a tree as a problem, but a tree as a holiday decoration.
Sounds like a plan. We'll talk to you guys in December. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming today.